Thank you for spending some time with us on the important topic of private resource mobilization. And importantly, we need to acknowledge and thank the E-Extension Foundation, especially web developer Mark Locklear, who we just heard from, in whose good technological hands we are today. So I appreciate that very much, Mark. Our approach while we're together over the next hour is to review the current status of the task force's work, stopping at 3 different places to seek your input on some key questions. Additionally, as Mark said, we're going to record the webinar for those who weren't available to watch it in real time today, and also leave the record open for them and for you if you choose to think more and provide input up and through November 21st. So let's get going. The goal of the PRM project is to consider opportunities that to organize an effort that seeks private funding that's complementary to established public appropriations. This really isn't a brand new idea. Many of our states. All right, so we're now at the issue. I've just recapped for those, and sorry for the disruption, talked a little bit about the stimulation having come from that September contracted study that ECOP did. The issue that we're dealing with is to recognize that there's no effective national brand, but we do have significant resources distributed across the nation. This document that was produced by Changing Our World observed the value of a national extension system that if we work together, we can create a whole bigger than the sum of our parts, while simultaneously maintaining the individual identity of our organizations. A canopy was used by the Changing Our World group to describe the effort, with the strength of the national effort provided by the legs of each program entity, that's our institutions, and the ribs of this canopy, metaphorically, provide the fundraising strategy, the scale, and the stability. Now, importantly, a canopy, when thought of in this way, doesn't restrict or impede each institutional pillar from fundraising based upon their own needs. A gradual approach is seen by this task force, learning as we go, always respecting the ongoing work of our institutions while engaging the entire system with a clear value proposition. The charge of the task force from ECOP was 6-fold. 1, to develop a case statement for this activity. 2nd, outline a 3-year development plan. 3rd, frame a development coordinating committee. 4th, consider an institutional home in which to house the effort, estimate the costs, and then to name some prospects. What are the kinds of potential benefactors who might be attracted to this effort? The Private Resource Mobilization Task Force began with membership including Bill Hare from the District of Columbia, Laura Johnson from Georgia, Ray McKinney, Virginia, Scott Reed, Oregon, Roger Rennekamp, Ohio, and Tony Wyndham in Arkansas. Now, Tony moved to another position and had to resign from the task force, and because all regions were still represented, we chose not to replace him. Importantly, though, the task force is assisted by Executive Director Jane Schuhart and the Regional ED Ron Brown, without whose contributions we wouldn't have made much in the way of progress. Thus far, we've organized, outlined, and drafted a status report whose closure depends on the system's reaction to key questions. That's the point we're at now, and the conversation that we'd like to engage viewers in. We're headed towards a wrap-up and a final report to ECOP not later than spring of 2017. Now, if you were at the National Extension Directors and Administrators meeting in Wyoming, some of this will feel a little bit familiar to you, including some of the slides. There was an Ignite talk and a few questions to gauge our connection to where the directors and administrators were thinking at that time. And here's what we learned in September when we were in Wyoming. First, we learned that more than 9 out of 10 respondents support seeking private resources for the National Cooperative Extension System, provided the effort is complementary to public fund development, not in competition with specific efforts at any institution, and doesn't require additional assessments in the first year. Another finding from there was that an existing foundation, such as the E-Extension Foundation, was the first choice for an institutional home. Using existing funds from the current ECOP budget was the preferred option for startup resources, followed by a membership approach or an additional assessment in the long term. And finally, naming a separate oversight team to gauge strategic priorities and related funding prospects were recommended over just assigning this work to, for example, the ECOP program committee or administering a survey through the ECOP national office. But clearly it will be important to decide from among the many options and competing priorities what we might want to tackle. So let me review the case statement a little bit. And this was written for the system more than for donors to illustrate for our sake what the potential looks like. And the potential looks pretty significant if you accept what has been recently published. In 2015, United States colleges and universities raised more than $40 billion, a 7.6% increase over the previous year. In fact, it's increased every year since 2010. Historically, gifts to universities have supported things like faculty positions, infrastructure like buildings, athletics, and student scholarships. But the nature of what funders want to support is changing due to the emerging emphasis on community engagement in higher education. So the research we're looking at today suggests that higher education donors are less likely to give to institutional goals and more likely to give if their support yields tangible community outcomes. And here we just did a hypothetical calculation that if we were to raise only 1% of all of that by US universities, that would amount to some $400 million or 100 million more than the current Smith-Lieber appropriation. As the task force and the report from Changing Our World talked about the features of an institutional home that should be considered, the kinds of things they considered and that I'd ask you to consider before you vote your preferences include things like the institution's activities and culture around fund development. Do they know the business of philanthropy? Things like strategic fundraising, planning, identification, cultivation, and soliciting of donors, maintenance of records and appropriate stewardship with donors. A second area that we seek to optimize in our institutional home would be around operational activities, effective administration of things like financial accounting, funds distribution, project oversight and management, reporting to donors, and then back to ECOP and the cooperative extension system. And finally, the management of an office and its efficiencies. There are things around like record keeping, accountability, the availability of legal counsel, marketing and communications, and information technology. That's what I'd like you to consider as you now begin to register your votes around which would be your first choice, E-Extension Foundation, APLU, and then the ECOP office, or the National 4-H Council. Thank you. That's very, very meaningful results. They came by me pretty fast, but it looked to me like the preferred first choice is National 4-H Council, second choice E-Extension Foundation, third choice APLU, ECOP.
Yep.
All right. Now I can advance the slide. I think we intended to allow people to offer some additional ideas, Mark. It's pretty clear that there's more than 3 places we might choose to go. And at this point, I'd invite anyone who has suggestions of alternatives or some particular justification for their first choice to go ahead and put that in the chat box. Okay, I think I'm just going to continue going. The
Scott,
people...
Right before you go there, Lila put a question in chat there that's sort of open to everyone. Why don't you look at that? You may want to address that now or...
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I see it. What about the Federal Private Public Fund Development Organization that was created a few years ago? That's not immediately coming to mind what that is. Jane, can you help me out here?
I'm thinking that Lila might be referencing the Foundation for Food and Ag Research, where public funds were offered that have to be matched with private fundraising. And our contractor, Changing Our World, did have a conversation with them, and it did not emerge as one of the top 3 from that initial work that would be acceptable and most advantageous for our effort here should we move forward with it.
Thank you, Jane. And Nick Place comes in and offers to all of us about some justification for 4-H Council as the institutional home and refers to the FFAR in terms of the public-private partnership. Well, let me move us on to the next kind of section of this webinar, and it's a meaningful part of the private resource mobilization thinking, and that's the 3-year plan. And I referred earlier to the fact that it will ramp up over time, and we will learn as we go. But let me review the 3-year plan as we have conceived of it, and then ask you to indicate your general level of support and ways that it might be strengthened. Year 1 of the plan that we've conceived of focuses on the establishment of an operational infrastructure that builds on the work of the institutional home team that we ultimately select. The initial focus is, 1, to establish a development office and a process, including governance, that will have an oversight provided by a program oversight committee that's composed of internal and external stakeholders. Secondly, that Year 1 finalizes a development plan that will be complete with an operational structure and implementation strategies. Third, it will engage the cooperative extension system in the establishment of a baseline startup budget from which we'll fully launch the program. And finally, it will seek 1 or more what I'm calling inaugural donors, as supported by the polling at the National Extension Directors and Administrators meeting. The task force currently sees work in Year 1 as possible with an investment from existing ECOP funds, the amount to be determined. But Year 1, as you can clearly see, is a startup year where we get our feet on the ground, partnerships and processes identified. During Year 2, we'll require a substantial commitment of the system. Based upon success in Year 1 and identification of an institutional home, we anticipate the hiring of a part or a full-time Chief Advancement Officer. ECOP will need to identify a sum of funds to be determined that will be used for this leadership position that would be anticipated to be administered within employment and supervision of the institutional home, whoever that comes to be. Now, a systematic database of prospects will also be needed, and we believe Year 2 is the time that that would be produced, or at least begun in a meaningful way. Prospects would be potential donors on which we would focus and advance this project. Although the following will be done on a continuing basis, we believe that a 4-phase approach is envisioned for developing this prospect list that include things like identification of prospects, research about their priorities and giving histories, tracking them over time, and finally stewardship, the development and maintenance of relationships. By Year 3, it's envisioned that we have a fully developed fundraising plan. It's well underway with top donor prospects, researched, cultivated, and provided, who are providing a significant level of sponsorship. Directors and administrators by Year 3 should know enough and have enough confidence in this system to have opted in at some level of ongoing support. And importantly, shared information about this with our field personnel nationwide so that we can use our thousands of employees as mini fund development officers. That's my word, it's not in the task force report. We see a strong collaborative relationship among PRM partners. For example, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research that Lila called our attention to, the National 4-H Council, E-Extension, ECOP, EPLU, relevant professional organizations, and industry. Lastly, we believe success will only be apparent and long-term if we've established the kind of partnerships with a few leading corporations or foundations such as Walmart, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation that's already underway, many of us know, W.K. Kellogg, and others. Very good, thank you. And I see that reassuringly, a very significant majority either agree or strongly agree. The next part of your collective input is should be shared on your screen. It asks a question of how might we consider strengthening this 3-year plan. So it's a nice opportunity to have a chat conversation, and I think we've got time, Mark, to engage in whatever people want to talk about. We've got an initial, in my mind, very important question, and it's all around, you know, how this system-wide development effort will go about coordinating and communicating with the home state of CES, where there is an extension service with existing donors in order to prevent confusion between the national effort and local development activities involving the same donor. That may be one of the most critical observations and questions that we have addressed. And while we don't have the mechanism completely defined, the only way that this national coordinated effort can and will go forward is if we are respectful of and know where donors are connected to our kind of home institutions, one or more, or the national effort, and to distinguish between the two. But I'm not able at this moment to answer precisely when and how that communication and coordination will happen. Okay, Rich Bonanno echoes the earlier comment about let's be clear that we recognize the potential conflict with state efforts and guard against that as we move towards implementation. Thank you, Rich. The third part of the webinar today gets at the point and the need for a durable coordination or oversight committee that's anticipated to be responsible for the financial aspects of centralized development, providing leadership to determine what the program priorities are, and to develop a portfolio of issue-based prospective funding sources. Now, specific attention is given here to national system priorities and program for resources that do not conflict with the current ongoing state and individual institutional efforts, which clearly begs the question of how should we systematically determine what the ongoing efforts are so that we can both understand, recognize, and then avoid this conflict that would be possible without careful management. The membership of this oversight committee that we are considering at the moment and would value your feedback about includes one, a member of this private resource mobilization task force, and I've reviewed the membership with you earlier in this webinar, an extension administrator from an 1890 institution, extension directors from one, a larger 1862 and a smaller 1862, recognizing that the context of fundraising is likely very different for those two kinds of institutions and therefore have both perspectives represented on the oversight committee, a representative from the institutional home office, quite likely the chief advancement officer, and we are imagining that the chief advancement officer may be the chair or the leader of this oversight committee, plus an additional 8 to 10 members that would consist of perspectives like the National 4-H Council, E-Extension Foundation. We want to be sure that the extension program areas, like youth development, family consumer sciences, community development, ag and natural resources, all have a lens into this committee. Someone from the experiment station section is a likely candidate, board on human sciences out of APLU, and finally, someone who connects to the Foundation for Food and Agriculture, we believe, might be the kind of individuals from these 8 to 10 additional slots. Okay, and once again, we have fairly strong agreement with 90% either agreeing or strongly disagreeing. And like before, we will go to, I think, the next opportunity to just invite your chat suggestions if you have anything else to suggest about committee responsibilities and or membership. We have a question for clarification. Who will be paying for this effort? We can't be specific beyond year one at this time. I think I remember to remark that when we were together at the national meeting in September, the endorsement was to use existing funds for year one. And it was at that same location that we were clear that would people support this effort if there were no additional investments or assessments in order to launch year one. However, if year one is successful and has the momentum then that causes us to go forward, there will be a need for resources to hire the chief advancement officer, and that is something that that ECOP and the oversight committee will need to clearly deal with. I would only offer that it would be my hope and expectation that by then we will have an ongoing and successful fundraising program that by itself could and may provide resources to help fuel the efforts itself. Jane refines of the Foundation for Food and Ag Research that was authorized in 2014, and that new authorization and funding is required for the next farm bill anticipated in 18, or the FFAR must be self-sustaining. Nick Place asks about terms and rotation of members. Great point, Nick. We have not kind of grabbed onto that yet. I suspect between now and when the task force finishes its work, we'll have a much more refined recommendation about when people come to and rotate off the task force. And this is from Laura Johnson, I think. Scott, I think the CAO would be hired by the board and not someone from the hosting institution. Okay. I'm not sure they need to be the chair either. Okay, good consideration. Thank you, Laura. And then a question, should the committee oversight be weighted to those funding the effort? Another very thoughtful observation. Nick says to pay for this, there could be an administrative fee assessed to cover necessary costs. And I assume, Nick, you mean a fee that would be indexed against funds raised, kind of like an indirect cost. Okay, I've advanced to the next slide, not seeing more chat information coming in, but you surely can still put information in the chat box. We are heading towards a wrap up of this webinar, and I'm going to assume no one's heart is broken if we don't take a full hour to do this. But a comment about next steps. You know, I hope it's clear that from the beginning, this task force has engaged and will continue to engage the cooperative extension section throughout our work. Following this webinar, the task force will be together sometime in the next 2 weeks, as I recall, to complete a status report that will go to the ECOP Executive Committee at their December 14th meeting. We will then decide what the level of interaction should be or needs to be between that December conversation with ECOP exec and then the spring ECOP meeting. But it's quite likely that we'll be back out in some way so the system can see what is in a penultimate draft form. And then, as I inferred earlier, we'll have final recommendations to ECOP by spring 2017. It's still your turn, however. I'm a little bit dismayed by the modest participation in this webinar. While I understand people are busy, and I hope and think that this should be an item of really key interest and concern. So we will be sharing the recorded version of this webinar, I believe, at next ECOP, the next ECOP Monday Minute, including another email announcement so that the record can be open to everyone on this webinar and others through email responses and comments. And Jane Schuhart has agreed to accept those. And you can see her email address here if you don't already have it close at hand. And we ask for any additional input by noon Eastern time, November 21st, so that the task force can fully consider your input. I want to stop because I know Jane can engage in live form if she wants to. Jane, is there anything you'd like to say additionally?
Thanks, Scott. Only to express appreciation to those that have been on the session today, and that I hope you'll encourage the colleagues in your region to view this webinar and to cast their, it's not a vote, we're not at the point of voting on anything. It's really a polling device in order to get a sense of the nation on what direction this task force might take. So once again, on behalf of Michelle Rogers and ECOP, we really appreciate Scott Reed and his leadership of this group, all the members, and for your full engagement today. Thanks, Scott.
Well, thank you, Jane. It's clearly a team effort. I've been really happy to work with this group, and I think we're making some reasonable progress that's resonating with those that are choosing to engage. Before we sign off, let me just thank Mark again and the E-Extension Foundation for helping to make this possible. Mark, we really appreciate your careful management of our conversation.
Sure thing.
Okay. And with that, I will sign off and look forward to any additional input that you choose to email to Jane. Keep tuned, folks. This is going to be kind of an interesting progression of work between now and spring 2017. Hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Scott and Mark. Bye.